apologize for the mix-ups that happened before this meeting started. It's shocking that the first time a Ghanaian wants to join the Gambian talk, he delays the whole thing and then creates pandemonium. But I hope by the end of the talk, I would have picked something from this conversation. Even though it's sort of a presentation, I would also want it to be sort of a discussion at the end. So if I leave certain things out of in the slide, I just want it to be discussion kind of. So as Omar rightly said, my research interest is in dementias, and I use a number of techniques to try to understand how we can develop new drugs for people living with Alzheimer's disease in particular. And it's quite new and strange in many ways because neuroscience is a field which is not as advanced as fields like issues relating to communicable disease or other fields in Africa as a whole. But this is something we need to take very serious look at, considering the fact that things are changing back home in terms of people living longer, in terms of people living very good lives. But the most important thing being that many people in the diaspora are moving back home to Gambia, to Ghana, and to many of the African countries. And most of these people will come with some of the conditions that we are not used to. We are also seeing things in Ghana that we call homecoming, or the year of return, where we have many Caribbeans and Americans moving back home and identifying that they are from Ghana or Gambia or other places because of the history of slavery. And most of these people are quite aged, and they will bring conditions that we are not used to. So it's important that we understand. But at the end of the day, it's also important that some of you will be inspired not to only follow Omar and Sekou and the rest in doing malaria and other transmissible diseases, but you also take particular note of neuroscience. And so one thing I would like to recommend to all of you is a podcast on BBC called The Comb. And it's a very fascinating podcast done by a woman called Kim Chakanek. I think she's from Zimbabwe. And what she does is every Friday, she brings a topic relating to Africa. And then there is a discussion. And I recommend that you listen. It's fantastic. And one that really caught my attention was one about epilepsy. And as you see on the title, it says epilepsy, not a curse. And many of you growing up would have seen issues with epilepsy where maybe a person had an epileptic seizure and people run away. And the reason being that we've grown to understand or to think that epilepsy is probably spiritual, or it's something that is communicable, or something that you can have. So if you see an individual have an epileptic seizure, you run off thinking that that person maybe is being cursed or something. And all these things, we've grown knowing them. And I know most of you will, of course, not believe that these things are superstitious or anything of that sort. But there is still that temptation that no matter how educated you are, you still want to come back to your roots and sort of put some of these things to superstition. And the more we do that, the more we kind of leave out the effort that we need to tackle them in the areas of science and medicine. So this is a recommendation that I'd like you to just follow up. But as Omar rightly said, my interest is in Alzheimer's disease, which is just one of the many dementias that we have. And dementia as a whole, most of them are neurodegenerative conditions or disorders. So they happen when the neurons in your brain, which are meant to transmit impulses and information and signaling, are destroyed, or they die, or they are damaged. And in that case, you end up with conditions including neurodegenerative disorders. And so what happens is there are problems with your neurotransmission, meaning that you have issues including losing things like short-term or long-term memory. You also have problems with coordination, even balance. And so some of these things can happen in younger ages. So there are some dementias that are very genetic. So people can have them through inheriting genes. And one common one is something called ALS. And some of you who are very present on social media may have remembered maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, something called the Ice Bucket Challenge, where people were pouring buckets of ice over their head to raise funds. And the disease they were raising funds for was called ALS, which is one of the degenerative conditions which has hereditary compartment to it, meaning that even young people can have it. But the disease I'm interested in, which is Alzheimer's disease, is mostly the disease of the aged, so meaning older people. But we also have just the type of Alzheimer's disease, which is called the familial Alzheimer's disease, which can happen to people who are just around 60 years, also because it has some genetic component to it. But most often, Alzheimer's disease has to do with damage to your neurons that comes with age, but then there will be lots of factors that happen to it. The truth is, we still don't know the main cause of Alzheimer's disease. So of course, if you don't know the cause, it's very difficult to find the cure. Alzheimer's is actually the 6th leading cause of death. Obviously, I'm talking about worldwide, not just in Africa. And more than 5 million people are living with Alzheimer's disease in the UK as we speak now. Most of these conditions are undiagnosed, for example. We are saying it's less prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa, according to the WHO and most of the health bodies. But there are many reasons why we keep saying this disease is less prevalent in Africa. The first thing is most of the research they do to look at prevalence in Africa, like when you read them, they are not the best in terms of how these things are carried out, because most often they are carried out by foreign scientists who try to understand how many people live with dementia in Africa, for example. And that's very difficult to find out. Also because one of the main reasons being that it comes to life expectancy. In the UK, people, life expectancy for men is just under 80, women over 80. In countries in Africa, most countries in Africa, the life expectancy do not go to that point. I'll give you a clear example of a country like Chad, where life expectancy sometimes is actually less than 50. And Omar and I have been in our lab making fun of other countries all the time about life expectancies. And the truth is, because most people in Africa do not live beyond a certain age, there is not that much time for the disease to happen. It's quite similar to cancer, where if the cancer has not got to do with lots of problems happening during your youth or something, you don't see many people with cancers in most of the African countries. It could be issues with diagnosis, but most of them also has to do with age. And so you would think, if it's not that prevalent in Africa, why should we be interested in even thinking about Alzheimer's disease in that context? And there are a few reasons. Alzheimer's disease is a very serious disease. When it happens, the time between when a person has been diagnosed to when the person dies on average is just about 10 years. Because when it happens, you lose many of your abilities in terms of carrying out your daily lives. And we are talking about people living in the West. If you've heard of something that we call euthanasia, where people are assisting other people to die in most Western countries. And what is happening these days is when a person realizes, or when they are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, they just go on and make the effort to get a doctor to help them die, because they cannot even cope with what is happening or what they are going to deal with. So if you look at the woman in the middle and the next slide, you can see that the family has surrounded the woman who has Alzheimer's disease because a doctor is administering a drug that will help this woman die. And it's just the fear of the woman not wanting to live with a disease like that, which she thinks is going to be a burden on her family. Of course, in an African setting, we are very, very alien to this sort of things happening. There is no way you would want a doctor to help you die back home, knowing that your logic of thinking is that you are not going to be a burden on your family. Actually, you think your family, you have the right for your family to take care of you. But this shows how serious the disease is, and the fact that we need to do more research to find out the cause of the disease and also develop cures for the disease in the future. But how does Africa come in here? The quote I have down there says, people wanted to burn her alive. And this is a quote from one country in Southern Africa that I would not want to mention. And the reason being that there was a woman who was just walking around like the street and blurting out things about being a witch and having done stuff to her children and all sort of things. And people kind of caught her, because we do believe in witchcraft, as I said from the beginning. Fine, most of us are religious and we may think it doesn't exist, but most of the African communities, we still believe in witchcraft. So they sort of they took the woman and believed everything she was saying. And the only reason she was not killed was because a relative of hers passed by and saw what was happening to her. And later on, I'm not going to say what's Alzheimer's disease, but they realized the woman has serious issues with cognitive function, meaning that something has happened, like it could be a form of dementia that had made her behave that way, walking around and saying things that she didn't even know were true. And so the danger with us dealing with neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's disease, is if we are tempted to add our form of spirituality and superstition to it, we may end up just associating most of the old people with dementia and Alzheimer's disease as being witches and wizards. And it's very common. If something tragic happens in most of our families, the first person we start to think about is grandma or great-grandma might be a witch or a wizard. And imagine the person has Alzheimer's disease and has issues with memory or is acting weird or behaving weird. There is the danger that if this person ends up on the street, she may be put to harm. And so it's very important that not only do we research about what is causing the disease or how we can find a cure to it, but we actually even have to be educated about what sort of disease it is. What are the signs? What happens to people when they have the disease? How can we live with people in that sort? And how do we protect them? And so recently I was trying to look at Alzheimer's disease in Ghana, for example. And I found out that there is only one care home for elderly people who are trained to look after individuals with Alzheimer's disease if they are brought into this care home. And a conversation with the owner of the care home, what happened is she's actually an American who has moved to Ghana like 4 years ago. And she told me the reason being that many Americans who have moved back to Ghana and live longer, when they have issues with maybe like a form of dementia such as Alzheimer's disease, there's literally no sort of care for them in our hospitals because people are not used to these conditions. So she set up a care home where older people with Alzheimer's disease can come live there. They've trained carers who can look after them. But the caveat is it is extremely expensive. So there is no way a poor person living in the outskirts of Accra in Ghana can take their older relative who has this disease to such a place. So we have to learn how to live with them. We have to learn how to find out how these things happen and how we're able to protect our old people. So like I said in the beginning, it's difficult to actually look and understand the prevalence of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease in Africa. So what you have here is just a map of some prevalence studies that they did a couple of years ago. And you can see that they are not even telling us how many people have Alzheimer's disease or dementia. They are just telling us population-based studies, like places where they've managed to do studies to look at prevalence of dementias in Africa. And you can see that the only country that actually has more than 4 studies done as of the time this paper was published was in Nigeria. Of course, you can see Gambia hiding somewhere there. And it looks like there is no study done there in terms of prevalence of dementias. And you can't blame people for these things. The reason being that if you want to do such a study, where do you even start from? Is there a place where, in a hospital where we have some sort of dementia clinic, the way we have HIV clinic and TB clinic, do we have anything like that back home? No, we don't. So where do you start from? Who is your population? Who are you even going to study? So that's something that is very difficult to look at. So the studies are not well coordinated. And also, if you look at the WHO, for example, over the last 10 years, they've kept repeating these numbers saying about 2.4% of over 50-year-olds in Africa have some form of dementia. So this is some form of dementia. There are about 12 different forms of dementia. So they haven't said anything about the type of dementia that these people may have. And they've just said 2.4% over 50-year-olds. And that comes to about maybe 2.7 million people at the time they were doing this study. Think about the fact that the largest population in almost all African countries are actually under 20. And so it's also very difficult to do this sort of research. But I will still make a case that even if you take the fact that, well, from everything that you've said, it looks like we don't have many people with a condition, or we don't even know whether the condition is there or not. The few people that will show up with a condition, because we don't know much about it and we haven't put much effort into it, these people will be at the greatest form of disadvantage. And this is why it's important that we have to keep going on. The last thing I wanted to say before I introduce what I do as a neuroscience researcher is the fact that there is a link between many of the neurological conditions we have and some of the diseases that are very prevalent in Africa. So for example, there is a very large cohort of studies that have been going on for the last 10 years in different countries, looking at neurological deficits that happen in people with HIV/AIDS. And so this is not dementia or Alzheimer's disease, but they are looking at some of the signs and symptoms that are very prevalent in people with dementia and Alzheimer's disease, being cognitive impairment. So cognitive impairment means people are not able to carry out just the normal mental acuity test that they should be able to do. Just few things about remembering, few things about putting 2 and 2 together to remember what happened maybe 2-3 days ago, being able to organize your life and many other things. What we found is people with HIV/AIDS have a very, very high degree of neurological deficits. And other studies have shown that when you compare people with HIV/AIDS, the neurological deficits actually get worse as the as the AIDS disease actually progress. And also, they've also shown that people who actually are on HIV drugs, so those who are on antiretroviral therapies, they are able to have low prevalence of these neurological deficits. So we are seeing that some of the diseases that we are very used to back home, there is some association with some of the neurological deficits, which are also signs and symptoms of dementia and other Alzheimer's disease. And so, having said all these, the idea is to just start and also continue to push for more people from Gambia, from Ghana, and from many other African countries to start being inspired to take up these challenges of studying neuroscience, and then not just going into dementia or going into Alzheimer's. There are lots and lots of opportunities in neuroscience that we can take hold of, bring them back to our countries, and be able to spread them in forms of education, in forms of public engagement and others, to create the awareness that we need. And most of you may have 1 or 2 stories about what I said from the beginning about epilepsy. Maybe growing up, you didn't know about the fact that it was actually scientific and it was an issue with your brain, and you believed it was superstition, and you believed in many of the things that people have said about epilepsy. But the more you grow up and read, you realize maybe there is something scientific to it. And maybe if you had gone on to do neuroscience and research and all that, you should be able to explain some of these things to members of your family, to members in your mosque, to people in your church, to be able to at least spread the word that these are things that when you see someone having an epileptic fit, you don't run away, you actually approach the person to help. Right, so with all that said, I have just 3 or 4 slides to introduce you to what I do here in Glasgow. And after that, I'll have one last slide where I'll just tell you about some of the challenges that neuroscience faces back home in Africa and the potential. So in our bid to find what happens in the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease and how we can understand this and help to develop new drugs, we have to use animal models to actually be able to understand this. And so in our lab, I'm not going to go into details to bore people, but in our lab, we use a mice model called the mouse prion disease. So prion disease is a form of neurodegenerative disease. And so what we have is just mice that express a form of protein that usually gets misfolded. So they usually get intertwined, and that is one of the causes of Alzheimer's disease. So we give these mice the protein that will make the proteins they have in their brain intertwine. And in that case, they start developing all the signs and symptoms of neurodegeneration. And so these mice, we follow them over a period of time. And we know that around 9 weeks after we've injected them with this disease-causing protein, these mice struggle with cognitive function, meaning that they struggle to understand some of the basic things that you expect mice to do or for mice to understand. And so we can then associate it with what we know and think that people with dementia or like Alzheimer's disease go through. So having been able to map the disease process in these mice, we know that around 12 weeks after we've injected the mice with the disease-causing protein, these mice will die. If nothing is done to them, if you don't treat them with any drug, these mice are going to die. And like I said in the beginning, the time between diagnosis and death in people with Alzheimer's disease is just around 10 years on average. But also 12 weeks in the life of a mice is quite like 12-week mice is actually an adult mice. So the model we have is a model which can recapitulate most of the things we see in human Alzheimer's disease, for example. So it's important that way. And being able to map this out, then we're able to then go on and carry on our experiments to show that maybe we can understand what is happening and see if we can actually use certain drugs to deal with them. So we have developed drugs in conjunction with pharmaceutical companies. And so we can test these drugs on our mice to see what is happening. I hope this video plays, but if it doesn't play, great, I'll just go back. And so what we have here on the top over there is a mice that has not been given any of the disease-causing protein. So this mice is a healthy mice with no problem. The mice in the middle is a mice that has the form of neurodegeneration that we are looking at. But then it hasn't been given any drug. It's just been given a vehicle. When we say vehicle is just the liquid that you dissolve your drug in. So you use that as a control. And here is another mice that has the disease, but also been given the drug that we believe is going to help deal with the neurological cognitive impairment that we see in people with Alzheimer's disease. So the drug we are using, or the drug we are studying in this case, is not meant to treat the disease, at least up to this point. It's not meant to treat the disease. It's meant to help make people who have dementia recover the neurological deficits that they have. And so these deficits are issues with remembrance. So if you have an older person with Alzheimer's disease, within a few years after diagnosis, he or she virtually forgets about other people. He or she would not even know the names of her children. She will not know where she puts things and many of these things. And me saying this, you sure you are thinking, oh, my grandmother or grandfather used to do that. They will not remember where they put stuff and all that. But these are things that we know happen in individuals with Alzheimer's disease. So our hope is that the drugs that we develop, when they take them, they will be able to help them rescue their memory and learning deficits. And the video will not be able to play, but just a brief explanation of what we do here is that we use a test called the fear conditioning. So when you have a mice and you put the mice in a cage, and if you look at this cage, you can see that there are wirings here. So these wires here are connected to some sort of electric. So you put the mice in there, we play a sound continuously for 18 seconds. And then the last 2 seconds, which will make it 20 seconds, the mice is shocked. So it's giving a really small electrical shock on the feet. So a normal mice, which is functioning normally, which has all the cognition working, with time, when you do this for 1 or 2, 3 times, the mice will associate the playing of the sound with a shock. So knowing that when the sound plays, I'm going to get shocked. So what happens then is, after the mouse has been trained that way, if you put the mice back in the cage and you play the sound, the mouse will freeze. And the freezing of the mice is an indication that the mice is scared. It's remembered that the sound is going to end up with a shock. So it freezes, and that's fear. So a normal mice will freeze. And that's an indication that the memory and everything is working fine. A mice that has dementia, in this case, our prion mice, will not freeze that much because it does not associate the sound with the shock because it's lost that memory. And so in this case, if you look at the figures here, the white one here is just a normal mice. And then the normal mice, when it's given our drug, you can see that it's still okay. It doesn't have any problem with. So here we say percentage immobility. So that's how long the mice freezes. And that's an indication that it remembers. So you can see that the normal mice with no drug and the normal mice with our drug, both of them still have significant percentage of immobility, meaning that they are still remembering that the sound will end up with a shock. So they freeze. And so you can see that they freeze about 60% of the time. On the other hand, the mice that has the disease and has not been given any drug is freezing just about 20% of the time, meaning that it still doesn't remember that the sound will end up with a shock. And that's a classic case of a mice having a cognitive deficit, or its learning and memory is gone. But that same mice, if that mice is given the drug that we are working on, you can see that there is a significant increase in the percentage of immobility, meaning that the mice that is sick, but then is given the drug, is now remembering that the sound will end up with a foot shock. And so it's getting really immobile, which is almost the same as the mice who is not sick. And this is very intriguing. Obviously, this is studies in mice, but I can reassure you that these drugs are now in the first in the first phase of clinical trials, but now it's just looking at safety. So we are just looking at how these drugs will be tolerated in humans before you can even start thinking about the efficacy, as in how the drug will work in context of these things we've done in the mice. Not only does the drug help with rescuing the learning and memory deficit, the drug is also helping in making these mice live longer. So the black line here are mice with the disease that have not been given any drug. And the longest they can live is just up to about 83, 84 days. But we can see that the blue here are the mice that have the disease and they've been given the drug. And by almost about 93 days, you can see that this is how far these mice will go in terms of living longer. So we can say categorically that our drug is actually prolonging the lives of these mice. So not only is it helping to rescue their learning and memory deficit, it's also helping the mice to live longer, which is quite important, as I said in the beginning, in context of people living just about 10 years on average when they have the disease. We've also tried so we have 2 drugs that we use in our group, and this is the second drug, which is giving us almost the same as I've explained in the past. It's also rescuing the learning and memory deficit and also making these mice live longer. And so these are the sort of things that I do here in Glasgow. And there are many other things, and using different techniques to understand the mechanism, how these drugs are working and all that. And we are pushing some of these drugs, working with pharmaceutical companies to make sure that some of these drugs can be taken into other forms of studies. There's just a paper that we are about to publish that is looking at not just mice, but also looking at other animals, including dogs and monkeys and gorillas and macaques, which are quite closer to humans in the context of using drugs in studies. And so we are seeing a translation from the lab using these mice to going through other animals. And the hope is that if we have very good results for the safety trials in humans, we could go on and do more things with this drug. So that is just me giving you an introduction and telling you what happens in terms of disease we work with, and also what I'm doing in the context of my research. But when we come to Africa, of course, I've spoken about many of these challenges already, about the fact that we apply superstition to many things. The studies we do are mostly done by people from outside, and so it lacks that context of African research. Some of the big challenges we find also has to do with funding. So most of the things I've spoken to you about in terms of the animal models we are using, the drugs we are using, and these experiments that I've been doing here in Glasgow, they do cost lots of money. And so if you go to an African government, or if you go to an African university and actually wants to carry out some of this research, it's a case of, do I fund this, which is going to cost me more money, or do I fund malaria or tuberculosis research? And so African governments are struggling with trying to understand why they have to fund neuroscience research in Africa, knowing that, you know what, we don't really see where this is going in the context of what is it preventing. And so one of the big issues we have with neuroscience research in Africa has to do with finance, superstition, obviously. Also, neuroscience in this context is a broad area. So the only area I've spoken about today is just about the neurodegenerative context, which is Alzheimer's disease and the other dementias. We also have the psychological aspect of it and the psychiatric aspect of it. We have lots of madmen and women roaming the streets of Africa, in Gambia and Ghana and all these countries. And again, it's either superstition, or they were smoking weed, or they did something wrong. But most of these people have clearly defined psychiatric disorders that if we have enough funding for research and for treatment, we could get most of these people off the streets. I don't know about Gambia, but in Ghana, we have just only 2 psychiatric hospitals in a country of almost 30 million people. And the last time I checked, there were under less than 10 psychiatric experts in the country for 30 million people. So you do your maths. So we are struggling. And the reason being that when these individuals train abroad and they want to move back home, they struggle. The support is not there, the facilities are not there, and this is very difficult for individuals. So we are struggling with just the public, the government helping with funding. We are struggling with the fact that neuroscience is so broad that there are so many different aspects of it that we need many people, we need all the experts in the world to be able to help. But after saying all these challenges and not wanting to be a prophet of doom, there are lots of potential for neuroscience research in Africa. And one that I remember very well is that in South Africa, the University of Cape Town, they've established a very prominent neuroscience facility there, which is being a very, like a trailblazer in terms of neuroscience research in Africa. And most countries around Africa, like Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, and other places, are also introducing models that they can use to study neuroscience, which does not cost them that much money. So Omar will be my witness. We spend thousands of pounds. Also, I'm sure there are many of you here who are researchers who know that it costs thousands of pounds to maintain all these mice and do these experiments. But back home, people are now using this worm. It's just a worm called the C. elegans. And it's very fascinating to know that people are using them to do neuroscience research, not just in the West, but now in Africa, as I mentioned, in Cape Town, also in Nigeria. People are using these mice. They cost, not mice, worms. They cost very, very less to look after. They breed a lot. And so there is that potential to do all this research. But the key thing there is, after you've done this research, are we able to now extrapolate or put this research into other animals like the mice and also into human at the end of the day? Because that's what like every neuroscientist wants to see, that your research has actually been translated into human research. There are other places in Africa where people are using mice. Back in Ghana, I know people have some mice for experiments and also in South Africa, but there is so much cost to keeping them. But there is still that potential of people finding different ways of recycling or using these mice sensibly to help save money. And so in the face of all these challenges, there are also the potential for neuroscience research. When the podcast that I introduced you to about epilepsy, when you listen to it, you realize that there are many people who do have some skills and knowledge of neuroscience because they may have trained abroad or they may have trained back home. And now they are going out through public engagement opportunities to speak to people about the challenges and potential of neuroscience in the countries that they live in. I think another challenge is the fact that most universities and training institutions back home do not have the skills to train the next generation of neuroscience, because obviously neuroscience in Glasgow, for example, people actually do it as a first degree and then go on to other things. Of course, you can also do a first degree in many different fields related to medicine or biology, and then go on to do a PhD or a master's degree that will give you the skills to be able to do neuroscience research. And so to end everything I've said today, there is a great potential for neuroscience in the context of helping to deal with many of the conditions that we have back home. Even if not for the dementias and the Alzheimer's disease I've talked about, we have many psychiatric conditions going on back home that knowledge of neuroscience will be able to help us to deal with. One thing I failed to mention is I'm also a firm believer in using our own traditional African medicine to help treat some of the conditions that we face back home. But all this will not happen if we don't have people who are knowledgeable enough to be able to extract whatever components we have in this traditional medicine, to use them in their research, and at the end of the day, to be able to push to say, we think these medicines can help in some of the conditions that we are facing. And so there is the challenge, but there is the potential. And I will be more than happy to discuss some of this in the question time, and also to encourage some of you to have a proper look at neuroscience as a field of research that maybe in the future you may want to look at, and also help change the course of health in Africa. Thank you very much. And thanks again to the organizers for inviting me. And again, I do apologize for the mishaps that happened in the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. That's a fantastic talk. As most of us would agree with me on this platform, we are, with one way or the other, cross paths with the many Ghanaian teachers in our schools in the Gambia. And as you know, Louis is as fantastic as most of them. So I think I would leave Mustafa to lead the question section. But before that, Louis, I have a question for you.
Right.
In diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, the fact that it manifests later in life, does it have any genetic relation, or can you use genetics approach for diagnosis like PCR and those kind of things, molecular biology? Right.
So as of now, the clearest way to diagnose Alzheimer's disease is to dissect the brain of a dead person and show that the person has NFTs and plaques. But we now have imaging techniques, for example, to look at the brain. And through imaging, you can first of all look at how the brain even is able to metabolize fructose and glucose. That will give you an indication that the person is having some neurodegenerative disorders. Coming back to the genetics, there are 1 or 2 genes that we've now very much associated with increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, one being apolipoprotein E and the other one being clastrin, for example. And these genes, when you find them in individuals and they have certain polymorphisms in these genes, you can attribute the fact that these persons have about 2 or 3 times risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in the aged. The only problem is not all of them will go to develop the disease, and not all the people that have the disease have these genetic problems. And so it is something that is very difficult, but yes, genes are playing a major role. And another thing I mentioned was the fact that there are people who have familial Alzheimer's disease where it runs through their families, but we are still struggling to understand that aspect of the disease. The last thing I will say is we are also interested in looking at biomarkers in the blood and also in the CSF, in the cerebrospinal fluid. And even in the research that we've been doing in our lab, we've identified many proteins that we are seeing changes both in the brain and in the blood. And many studies have shown that maybe in the future, in the very near future, we should be able to at least tell people that they run a risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in the future if we find certain proteins in their brain, in their blood and in their CSF at an early age, because the issue is early diagnosis remains the key to preventing people from developing all the nasty symptoms when the disease progresses.
Thank you very much, Lewis, for that wonderful talk. It seems like we do not have many questions, but I just wanted to do a follow-up on what Omar was talking about, because you nicely laid out the fact that life expectancy in Africa is quite low as compared to the West, and maybe that's why you don't see a lot of manifestation of this. But yeah, you touched on the genetic predisposition, but wouldn't it be more prudent if neuroscience was shifting towards looking at genetic predisposition in Africa? Because maybe that might at least give us an idea of how likely you are to develop some of these complications, and also looking at it in the context of infectious diseases. Like you said about the HIV case, could it be like this is some immunological mechanism that is contributing to why you're having neurodegeneration, which is more of like a latter effect of an immunodeficiency per se? So I don't know much about that in neuroscience context.
Yeah, I agree. I think the genetics, the issue is Africa has the largest gene pool that you find anywhere on this in the world. And so even with normal genetic screening and stuff that people have tried to do in Africa, you find that we have it's so heterogeneous in terms of the sort of genes you'll be finding back home. But I agree, we can start looking at the gene pools in Africa and see, like some of these genes that I've mentioned, most of these are done in Caucasians. So have we done this in Africans to actually understand that, oh, maybe there are different genetic polymorphisms in Africans that may predispose them to having some of these neurodegenerative conditions? We don't. And I'll give an example of diabetes, for example. Type 2 diabetes was not prevalent in Africa over a long period of time, but the studies have shown that when Africans move to America, they stand a greater chance of developing type 2 diabetes than the African Americans that were born in America. And that's something we should be looking at. So genetics do play a major role in neurodegenerative disorders, and we haven't even scratched the surface of it yet. And also, we can also start looking at our infectious disease and how they relate to causing some of these neurodegenerative disorders. So HIV is a classical example. I'm sure tuberculosis is also an example that we should be looking at, which we haven't, because we are struggling. We are all interested in trying to prevent people from dying from these diseases. So maybe the long-term effects we are not looking at the moment.
Thank you. So the next question is from Sekou Konate. He said, who is likely to suffer from this disease?
Sekou wanted to say something. Maybe he's lived in Ghana, so he wants to support.
Fine.
No, just I'll follow up on that.
Yeah, someone asked who is likely to suffer from this disease. I think he's talking about Alzheimer's. Like risk factors.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to tell who is apart from the genetics that we've said, like saying if you have certain polymorphisms in some genes, then you have a high risk of developing the disease. It's very difficult to tell offhand that these people are likely to have the disease. But one thing I can say is if you have individuals in your family that have had any form of neurodegenerative disease, you are more likely to be worried because there are lots and lots of genetic connotations to most of these diseases. But it's very difficult to tell offhand, like to a young person, I think you are going to have the disease. The only thing I can say is if it's something you've seen in your family, maybe you should be careful about. But apart from that, it's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, Louis, just to follow up on the previous two questions, given the fact of the link between immunity, metabolism, and infection, I'm just wondering if there's any potential link between, let's say, the innate immune metabolic responses and Alzheimer's disease. Is there any link in the area?
There is. I mean, people call Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes because the diabetic patients, for example, do have a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease because insulin and sex hormones even play a role in Alzheimer's disease, for example. So yes, also there is now very good research talking about even gut metabolism. The sort of microbiome you have in your gut can also predispose you to have an Alzheimer's disease in the future. And that has to do with your immunity as well. So it's a huge field that's why it's important that we have more Africans going through this and then looking back home, because no matter where you are doing this sort of research, you will still be thinking about your continent in a way of how can I translate this research to helping my own people back home.
Okay, just shifting a little bit more away from the science, but more of like let's say selection, if you like. So
Right.
growing up, if you are doing science at least in the Gambian context, you don't be a doctor, a nurse, all on that line. Some of us are seeing that like an outline in the whole system, if you like. So I'm just wondering, what is your take on how do we encourage more students to go into other sciences besides medicine and nursing?
Well, we have to change that whole idea of, so it's either you're it's either you're a doctor, you're a nurse, you're an engineer, or you're a disgrace to the family, because you have to do some of these things. Otherwise, that's it. We need to encourage more people, because that's why I'm very, very, like, I'm not sure Omar has said this enough. I'm very, very, very happy with what you are doing in Gambia, like you guys coming together to do this. It's very encouraging because, Sekou, you've been in Ghana before. When people are studying medical lab or biochemistry or anything of that sort, their main aim is to end up working in the hospital. Nobody is thinking about going into research. You need another person, like Omar rightly said in the beginning. I was an intern at the military hospital. My aim was to finish, go into the military and join the medical corps. It was my boss that told me, get out. Only because I was working with a research institute called Noguchi. They were doing these things with the American Navy. And that's where I developed my research ideas. So we need to start encouraging more people. Doing this, talking to people, like any place you find yourself, you try to encourage your fellow Africans to think about research more, because it's very, very important. You know, yeah.
Omar, there's a question. Mustafa, there's some question, I think.
Yeah, there's another question. Great presentation. How expensive is doing neuroscience in Africa? I think you've touched on this a bit, but I think because it's a diagnostic group actually. So I think for context wise.
Well, see, we all talk about money. It's expensive, but there are other ways that you can contribute that will help. Like, that's why coming to the end, I was talking about the fact that neuroscience is not just about the Alzheimer's and the dementias. It also encompasses psychiatry. And we can think about, in Ghana, we have one psychiatric nursing training school, and all they do is train psychiatric nurses. And it's really important because these nurses come out well-versed in psychiatry, and they're able to identify and help people. So it's not even taking the research aside. We can get nurses and doctors in Gambia and Ghana and give them training in how they can identify some of these conditions, and how they can even encompass their clinical work with some sort of research. So I'm sure I saw someone mention that you have doctors and nurses who can be researchers as well. And they can be very good as well because they work with the patients and they'll be able to see things that other people may not see. So yes, it's expensive, but everything is expensive when you move to Africa. It is. But you have to get it done. And at the end of the day, that's what we are all hoping to do.
Okay, and there's another question from Mohammed Hydra. It says, unfortunately, we don't have a neuroscience course at the University of the Gambia, but does this interrelate with neuropsychology?
Yes, it does. And so my advice is, like I said, most universities back home have courses that they know will benefit the country that the university is situated in. So if you don't have a neuroscience course and you are doing any biology or biochemistry or something related, just put at the back of your mind that maybe in the future I would want to move on, maybe do a master's or a PhD somewhere with a neuroscience context. So yes, like I mentioned rightly, in Glasgow and other universities here, they do have neuroscience as a degree, and they know, and that's because they are suffering from all the conditions, and they want something that would train people and come back and follow them. So if you don't have something like that in Africa, we can still move on and do these things in postgraduate training. And it's not just for people who are not who are into biology and stuff. Doctors and nurses, as I said, can also go on and specialize in these things and come back home and help us.
Thank you. Seems like that's it from the question side. Okay, there's someone who said, what are the best medication for Alzheimer's disease?
Right. So at the moment, there is no medicine to treat Alzheimer's disease, but there are medicines on the market that are helping to, like I rightly said, restore your cognitive deficit, to help you deal with the memory loss and the coordination. The problem is these medicines, they don't work for all the people struggling with Alzheimer's disease. And they also have significant adverse side effects, including people having heart problems, because the receptors or the proteins that these drugs are targeting are also found in the heart. So you take a drug for Alzheimer's disease and you start having a heart attack. People have diarrhea, people have nausea. And so the drug is not even working in all of these people. And it's also giving adverse side effects. And that's why we are interested in pushing different drugs and seeing how we can make effective drugs that are less harmful. In an African context, I'm also, like I rightly said, interested in Ghana, for example, we now have people doing degrees in herbal medicine. The problem is they all finish and they want to go work in the hospital, not to into research to see how we can make use of the sort of medicines that we have back home, to see if we can purify some of them and see if they can help in any way. So the answer is there is no drug to cure the disease. We just have few drugs to manage the symptoms, and they have very bad adverse side effects.
Okay, and this is more of a comment from Ayodele Blah. I have been doing follow-ups of Alzheimer's disease on TV stations that treating it would be very difficult, but still they are doing efforts which will turn well for us here in the Gambia. Areas of such are not empowered or neither encouraged to study. The first time I said I would love to study neurology to be a psychiatrist, I was told that it would be very difficult because it's not available. I think this person is just talking about the challenges and the stereotypes that are associated with things like neuroscience.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much for that comment.
Yeah, and the other one is, what percentage does the disease affect people in Africa and the world at large? But I think you touched on that a bit.
Yes, it's still touch and go, but in Africa, most of the numbers you find is just as saying 2.4%, around 2.4% of people over 50 have some form of dementia. So when they say form of dementia, it could be any of the 11 to 12 forms of dementia, not necessarily Alzheimer's disease. So the numbers are quite difficult. And that's another area of research that we should be looking at. And like right now, I'm coordinating a research with colleagues in Ghana looking at the impact of antiretroviral drugs on people with HIV who have neurological deficits. And that's something that if you are one of the researchers here who lives abroad outside of Gambia, these are the things you can start looking at. Are there ways I can coordinate with colleagues back home to see if we can do something meaningful? So yes, the numbers are weird, but I would say about 2.4% of people over 50.
And maybe I will do this as the last two questions.
Right.
Does one's environment contribute to these neurodegenerative diseases, like environmental factors?
That's a very good question, and the condition is a multifactorial condition. So yes, I would say the environment do contribute, but how much it does is very debatable. We've talked about issues about like lead, for example. lead accumulation can lead to problems in the neurons and can kill the neurons. So that's one thing. But all these environmental things we talk about is the accumulation of them up to the old age that can lead to some of these diseases. But because sadly most of us die before the accumulation actually manifests, because maybe malaria or TB may kill you before Alzheimer's disease shows up, it's very difficult to study the environmental impact in Africa. But yes, environment do play a role.
And a topical one, considering the current climate we're in, could neuroscience be the answer to help scientists figure out the risk of vaccines?
The risk of vaccines. I mean, it's difficult to answer, but all I can say is there are neuroscientists who are also looking at the neuroscience effect of COVID, for example, how COVID damages the brain, for example. But in terms of vaccines, it's difficult. All I can, maybe when you're a neuroscience researcher, you have other skills that you can contribute to trying to answer questions outside of your field. But to figure out the risk of vaccines, it's quite difficult for me to explain in that way. Sorry.
And maybe the last question is, what is the level of chronic inflammation contribution to neurodegenerative disease?
Very good question as well. Sekou mentioned inflammation. So one of my big areas of research is inflammation, its contribution to neurodegenerative disorders, because we have neuroinflammation, which can lead to your neurons being targeted by your own system, or even the neuroinflammation itself just killing your neurons. So one aspect of my work is looking at how inflammation actually exacerbates or makes the disease worse in the context of neurodegeneration. So yes, it does play a big role, but it's still subject for research.
Yeah, and the last question is, I've kept saying the last question, but this is the last one, I promise. Which category of people age does Alzheimer's disease likely affect?
It's a disease of the age. So usually you find people from the 70s. The older you grow, the higher your risk of developing the disease. But back home, it's the same. It's just that the age in a way helps us because people don't get to that point. But yes, I would say categorically that there are many people with Alzheimer's disease. We just don't diagnose them and we give them other conditions. So age does play a big role. The older you grow, the more likely you have the disease.
Okay, since we don't have any more questions on the chat, I think
Umar, back to you.
Wait.
Yeah,
one.
I'm having a mini meeting on the side here. With Lucy's friend is here.
That's what I got.